Now it's time for Uncancelled. This is where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. And right from the very start of the pandemic, the world has naturally demanded answers on the future of COVID-19. But rather than relying on the scaremongering predictions of doom merchant boffins, should we have looked to history? Think back to the run-up to Freedom Day, when Professor Neil Ferguson warned there could be up to 200,000 COVID cases a day, and 1,200 doctors and scientists branded our return to normality a dangerous and unethical experiment. Perhaps they would have done well to research the ultimate Freedom Day, November the 11th, 1918. Now stick with me, the end of World War I was a far less sombre affair than you're probably picturing, with wild parties completely devoid of social distancing, despite the fact that the second wave of the Spanish flu pandemic was in full swing. And in his excellent investigation into the parallels between these two devastating public health emergencies, David Livermore, the professor of medical microbiology at the University of East Anglia, explains any epidemiologist would tell you that this partying spree was guaranteed to trigger a flood of infection. But the simple reality is that something that should have driven a dramatic rise in infections and deaths largely failed to do so. Rather than hazarding guesses that have devastating consequences for our way of life and create a climate of fear, the professor writes, we must acknowledge the unpredictability of pandemics and the limits on our ability to extrapolate the future. So, Professor David Livermore, it's absolutely brilliant to have you here. I found it a completely fascinating piece, and I learned a lot, actually. And it's really interesting to note that maybe history teaches us much more about the future of COVID than some of this modelling, which has been wrong time and time again over the past 18 months.
Well, I think so, absolutely. I mean, so much is said about this being an unprecedented event, and it isn't. We had a major pandemic from 1889 until 1894, the so-called Russian flu. It may actually have been a coronavirus. There's debate about that. And then the influenza pandemic, and it definitely was influenza, in 1918, 1919, which had its deadliest wave in the October. In Berlin, and I think it was the 18th of October, 1,700 people died. And London, Paris were having similar major waves through the October. And then, of course, the war ended on the 11th of November, and in the victorious capitals, London, Paris, the major American cities, there was a great outpouring of people onto the streets to celebrate a great release of tension, that people had lost loved ones, but people were also celebrating victory. So they poured onto the streets, they took over the buses, they told them to go anywhere. The people got kissed for being wounded soldiers or whatever.
It was party time.
Absolutely.
It was party
Churches
time.
had services through the afternoon, there was singing, the concert halls were open, and the evening became fairly decadent by all accounts. So there's plenty of descriptions of what happened at AGP.
The original
Taylor,
Freedom Day, you might say.
Absolutely, writing of people copulating in doorways, though I suspect that was a pretty exceptional event. But
I'm not so sure. Remember, they'd just gone through a world war. And then there isn't the explosion in infections that you might expect, just like after our Freedom Day.
You would have expected at least the infections or the deaths had peaked, but you would have expected this bacchanalia, this celebration, this great release of tension to at least have given a spurt to further infections, but it didn't. A near symmetrical curve of infection and death came down. That wasn't because all the vulnerables were immune or dead, because there was a further wave of infection came up in the February of 1919. So the point is that, contrary to what the modellers tell us, these pandemics go up and down in a series of waves which are not as predictable and not as controllable as we like to imagine. And we've seen that repeatedly with the present COVID pandemic as well.
And of course, there is a school of scientific thought, and you don't hear much about it in the mainstream media because it doesn't fit the traditional or the orthodox narrative, I guess. But there is a school of thought that actually, irrespective of lockdowns, these waves, these COVID waves may well have been the same, and actually lockdowns won't have done much to actually stop the waves. Do you buy into that at all?
I think lockdowns have done much less than their proponents would like to claim. The classic demonstration of that is if you look at the first wave of infection, so going back February, March, April, May of 2020, then Spain and France had very strict lockdowns. You were hardly allowed to leave your house. The UK had a more moderate lockdown. And Sweden had no lockdown at all, and they all peaked similarly, and the shapes of the reduction in cases through the late spring were remarkably similar, irrespective of the strength of lockdown.
Yep, totally. So what can the Spanish flu epidemic potentially tell us looking forward about where COVID goes now?
You've got to be careful because Spanish flu was definitely influenza, and this is a coronavirus.
Also maybe the Russian.
Yeah, well,
what does that tell us?
It's harder because we cannot be sure whether that 1889 to 1894 pandemic was influenza or whether it was coronavirus OC43. If it was coronavirus OC43, well, it's still with us. It's one of the common cold viruses. We live in what I would call a dynamic equilibrium with it.
Which means COVID ain't going anywhere.
I do not believe we're going to eradicate COVID. I believe it's with us for the long term. The young who are growing up with it now will get repeated infections early in life. They will develop an immunity, and that will stand them in good stead. Later infections will be mild. People like me who are getting a bit long in the tooth are well advised, and I would strongly urge them to get vaccinated. It gives a push in the right direction. Well, but it's with us for perpetuity.
Well, I'm going to bring my panel in now, Abby Roberts, Calvin Robinson and Isabel Webster. I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? So much fascinating information from David Livermore, Abby. But an interesting one that you might want to pick up on, that actually it's important that our kids are potentially naturally infected in order to protect them in later life and also to protect society in later life, which maybe plays into your argument, Abby, about why we potentially shouldn't be vaccinating kids.
Yes, I mean, there's so much gone, so much to sort of to unpack here. Yeah. I just wanted to know what David's view was on whether if the virus did come out of the Wuhan lab and was, shall we say, adjusted. You know, the spike proteins were interfered with. What difference does that make to it appearing to be a natural virus in your view? Does it make a difference if it was tampered with?
For the present management of it, no, I don't think it does. Because whether it was a lab escape or whether it was an escape from animals, it's circulated, it's continued to mutate. We presently have the Delta variant, and that's what we must contend with. Certainly looking at older age groups, at anybody who's vulnerable, younger, but say asthmatic or diabetic, should very definitely be vaccinated. And I think anybody who's engaged in healthcare has a duty of honour to be vaccinated. But as we go down to younger and younger age groups, the value of vaccination diminishes because they're very unlikely to get COVID as a serious disease. And it is arguable that once we're getting down to those very young age groups, then it is actually better to be exposed naturally. And I say that because we now know that whilst vaccination is very good at protecting against severe disease, it seems much less good at protecting against infection and transmission. And People
Which is what
get
we
later
discussed earlier,
infections with COVID despite having been vaccinated, whereas people who've had natural COVID, it seems to be uncommon to get a second dose of it within a year. And we know that the immune response is somewhat different between infection and vaccination in terms, for example, of mucosal immunity and the fact that from infection you make antibodies not just to the spike protein but also to the end protein, the nuclear capsid protein. So there are, I will put it no more strongly than that, there are uncertainties here, and I do not believe that we should be rushing into vaccinating, for example, 16 and 17-year-olds.
Fascinating analysis. Isabel Webster.
I just wonder what you say to people who would describe your analysis of modelling as being a little bit unfair, that perhaps, you're suggesting that those who proposed lockdowns were, caused harm or whatever your assessment may be. But there would be an argument, would there not, that without them, you're just playing Russian roulette, that, it's safe until you blow your head off with a bullet.
Lockdowns have never been part of our historic policy of dealing with pandemics of this sort. And by not having lockdowns, by trying merely to protect the vulnerable, we haven't blown our heads off in the past. That the pandemics, relative to the populations of the time, both the 1889 to 94 and the 1918-1919 pandemics were worse than the present one. It was a leap of faith this time to go into lockdowns. And if there were a free policy with no costs, then there would be an argument for them. But the societal damage to people's mental health, to other factors in the health service, to the economy, to the vast debt in people's livelihoods has been considerable. This isn't a free policy. It's a dreadfully expensive and dreadfully socially harmful policy that's been pursued.
Calvin Robinson.
Thank you, Professor. I really want to break down into that a bit more, because you talked about the pandemic in 1918 was followed by Armistice Day and people were out celebrating and there wasn't a spike in infections. And we've talked about lockdowns potentially not having the desired effect. Could it be that they've actually been detrimental in pushing the outbreaks further into the winter, when we could have had more spread of the virus in the summertime when immune systems were higher and vitamin D levels were higher? Could they have been...
Which is what Patrick Vallance obviously warned of back in March 2020 before there was that great 180.
Have we made things worse?
It's debatable. It has been complicated by variants, the Alpha variant and then the Delta variant. But certainly Sweden, which accepted slightly more of a hit early on through not locking down, has fared no worse than places which did lock down, including ourselves, and we've had 3 lockdowns, and places that have even stricter lockdowns. Peru in South America has had some of the strictest lockdowns in the world, at least nominally, and it has the highest per capita death rate of any country.
David Livermore, you're absolutely brilliant. We're going to have you back, because I love the way you explain all of this stuff. Professor of Medical Microbiology at the University of East Anglia, so you definitely know your stuff. Thank you so much.